Hello there, and welcome back to Writing from Scratch with me, Tom. Last week I discussed the 6 months of progress that I'd made so far and the activities that I've been doing, as well as giving you some detail on the book that I'm writing. So on this video, I thought it would be good to take an opportunity to look at the mistakes that I've made and that I regret and the wish I could have prevented. I'm doing this in the hopes that you can avoid making the same mistakes that I did and looking back with a little bit of regret when it comes to writing your book. So let's have a look at the 4 biggest mistakes that I made while I was planning and starting my book. The first mistake I made was thinking that I need to use every idea I'd written down in my notebook. Especially at the start of my research activities, I found lots of interesting ideas and heard lots of great quotes that I wanted to incorporate into my book, and this was a massive mistake. The reason is quite simple in hindsight, but it wasn't clear to me at all at the time. Essentially, what I found was that I was changing my story in order to fit in some clever one-liners or soundbite that ultimately didn't contribute to the depth of my character or the story, and it even confused what kind of person my character was. Simply, it saturated my story with different tones, themes, and genres that didn't fit the plan that I'd been going for. There's nothing wrong with changing your plan, but doing so just for the sake of forcing in some idea that was incredibly negative. It's great to write down everything you find interesting and intriguing ideas that can give you inspiration to create new ones. But just remember that you don't need to use everything that you've written down in your diary, and often less is more, as we've discussed before. Keeping things simple makes your message clear, the characters consistent, and the story easy to follow. And I wish this was something I'd kept in mind instead of trying to force every idea that I came across into my book. The second one is one that we've discussed before in our first chapter video, but it's so important that I think it's worth mentioning again. And that is about using overly complex or advanced vocabulary. I was a little bit hesitant to include this one in the list, because ultimately it also depends on the audience that you're writing for. If you're writing for academics, then including complex or advanced vocabulary is natural and necessary. And if you're writing for children, you're smart enough to know not to do that. But for me, I hadn't really identified an audience, so when I started writing, I realized that I was only including this complex and advanced vocabulary for myself, as if using fancy words would somehow improve the narrative I was trying to create. Instead, what I recommend is that you should be focusing on what creates the most enjoyable experience for your audience and your reader. And 9 times out of 10, that is to use simple words, sentences, and grammar that communicate the story clearly and precisely. This is the best way to share your message with your audience. I think in the future, once you've established yourself a little bit better and feel more confident about writing, you will probably have more intuition about how to use advanced language and what good it can do and what it can allow you to express, or maybe even add more depth to your story or your notions. But my biggest advice to begin with, and from the feedback that I received from my proofreaders, was that my writing was too complex and the vocabulary was too high level, and scaling this back dramatically improved the feedback that I was getting from people who had read my story. So, like I said, of course it depends on your audience, but I would recommend trying to keep things simple when you're starting. Similar to the last point, I received a lot of feedback that I was including too much exposition. For those of you that don't know, exposition is chunks of text that explain what is happening. Usually this isn't in the form of dialogue or thoughts, it's the author telling the reader something about the world. It's important to note that exposition isn't always bad, and some of the most successful books give large amounts of information. But in lots of modern writing, employing a show-don't-tell attitude is a great rule to follow, and something that I didn't do at the beginning. Again, it ultimately depends on the genre that you're writing in. Fantasy and sci-fi especially need more exposition, because they need to set their scene and introduce the new world. Whereas novels such as mine, which are set in the real world, don't need much setup, as lots of the details can be assumed or imagined by the reader. I wish I had kept this in mind at the start and saved myself lots of time when writing. More than that, I found my writing wasn't staying on point because I was being distracted by telling my audience about things rather than showing it and advancing the story. Ultimately, this really depends on the genre you're writing, the audience you're writing to, and how much information you feel you need to give to the reader. But like in the last point, it's really important that you're keeping the reader enjoyment at the forefront of your mind and think whether this information is really necessary for them to enjoy the story. The fourth and final point is that I expected too much from my writing sessions. I found myself in a spiral of disappointment for a while, never quite achieving as much as I wanted from my sessions, whether that was research or writing. I think the issue here was over-planning and trying to put too much activities into too small an amount of time. Instead, the solution I should have been pursuing was to be reasonable and understand my own ability to produce. Being honest with myself allowed me to be more productive when I entered a session, and that's where having a list of tasks comes in really useful, as we discussed in our time management video. Instead of pressuring myself into completing every task in a session, I should have been reasonable and rational in my expectations and been patient with the progress. I suggest you try and do the same to make the experience more enjoyable and less stressful. So, those are the 4 biggest mistakes and challenges that I faced during the first 6 months of writing my book. I hope they're useful for you, and I hope they prevent you or help you avoid running into the same issues. If you've enjoyed this video, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing the video with your friends, because it really helps the channel out. Thank you very much, and I'll see you next time.